Picture the last wedding you went to. The rings, the vows. Someone standing at the front in white. A room full of people watching two people promise something to each other. Now start erasing pieces of that image. No rings, no white dress, no priest, no officiant, no legal paperwork at all. Just two people and their families agreeing that from this point forward, they belong to each other. For most of human history, that stripped-down version is closer to what a wedding actually was. Everything else, the dress, the ring, the ceremony itself, was added later, piece by piece, often for reasons that have nothing to do with love. And today it's an enormous industry built on that accumulated tradition. Weddings and the businesses around them, venues, rings, dresses, photography, generate somewhere north of $300 billion globally every year. An event that used to be, at its core, a private agreement between two families has become one of the most expensive single days most people will ever pay for. If you've never once questioned why weddings look the way they do, subscribe now, because that's exactly the kind of question this channel exists to chase down. Here's what makes this one harder to trace than shoes or beds. A wedding isn't an object. It doesn't leave a bone to examine or a buried artifact to carbon date. It's an event, a moment, and moments don't survive in the ground. What does survive in rare cases is the paperwork. The contracts, the receipts, the legal records people wrote down to make the arrangement official. So historians aren't digging up wedding rings first. They're digging up clay tablets. The oldest known written marriage contract comes from ancient Mesopotamia, inscribed in cuneiform on a clay tablet dating back roughly 4,300 years from the Sumerian city of Nippur. It lays out exactly what you'd expect from a legal document, not a love letter, property, obligations, and what happens if either party breaks the agreement. Marriage in Mesopotamia was fundamentally an economic transaction between families, formalized with a bride price paid by the groom's family and often a dowry provided by the brides, negotiated the way a modern contract negotiates the sale of land. Love, if it existed in the marriage at all, was considered a separate and unrelated matter. That's a 4,000-year-old prenup, essentially. If that changes how you think about "till death do us part," drop a comment. I want to know what surprised you most. That contractual logic runs through almost every ancient civilization historians have records for. In ancient Egypt, marriage required no religious ceremony and no state license at all. A couple was simply considered married once they began living together, and their arrangement, usually involving an exchange of property, was documented by a scribe. Egyptian marriage contracts, remarkably for the ancient world, gave women significant legal protection, including the right to retain property and initiate divorce. In ancient Rome, marriage took several legal forms, but one of the most symbolically important was confarreatio, a ceremony reserved for the elite, involving a shared wheat cake and witnessed vows, while ordinary Romans more often married through simple, undocumented mutual consent, no ceremony legally required at all. The objects we now consider essential to a wedding arrived surprisingly late, and almost all of them started as something else entirely. The wedding ring likely originates in ancient Egypt, where brides and grooms exchanged rings woven from reeds and rushes, worn on the fourth finger of the left hand because Egyptians believed a vein there, later named the vena amoris, ran directly to the heart. Romans adopted the practice and eventually shifted to iron and then gold. But the ring wasn't yet a universal symbol. It was still primarily a wealth marker for those who could afford one. The wedding veil traces back to Roman brides wearing a bright orange-red cloth called the flammeum, believed to ward off evil spirits on the wedding day, not to symbolize purity or modesty, meanings that were layered on centuries later by entirely different cultures. If objects quietly carrying meanings nobody remembers is the kind of thing that hooks you, go watch our video on the toothbrush next. Same idea. Completely different object. For most of the medieval period in Europe, marriage among ordinary people remained remarkably informal. A public declaration of consent between two people, sometimes as simple as holding hands and stating intent in front of witnesses, a practice historians call hand fasting, was often considered legally and socially binding with no clergy required at all. It wasn't until the Council of Trent in 1563 that the Catholic Church formally mandated that a marriage required a priest and witnesses to be valid, a direct response to the chaos of contested informal marriages and secret unions that had been causing property and inheritance disputes for centuries. Marriage didn't become a religious sacrament requiring an officiant because people suddenly wanted a ceremony. It became one because institutions needed a paper trail. The wedding as a lavish ceremony-first event, the version most people picture today, is largely a 19th century invention. Before 1840, brides typically married in their best existing dress in whatever color they owned, because owning a garment specifically for one day made no economic sense to most families. That changed almost overnight when Queen Victoria married Prince Albert in 1840 wearing a white gown, a choice that had nothing to do with symbolizing purity. Historians widely believe she simply wanted to show off expensive Honiton lace against a plain background. Newspapers covered the dress extensively, and within a generation, white became the aspirational standard for any bride who could afford it, eventually trickling down into an expectation almost everyone now assumes is ancient tradition. Quick reminder while we're here. If you're new to this channel, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We do exactly one of these deep dives every week. The diamond engagement ring, arguably the most universally expected wedding object today, is barely a century old as a mass tradition. Diamond engagement rings existed among European nobility earlier, but they were rare and reserved for the wealthy until 1947, when the De Beers Diamond Company launched an advertising campaign built around the slogan, "A diamond is forever." The campaign was explicitly designed to manufacture an emotional and social expectation that hadn't previously existed at that scale, linking diamond size directly to the depth of a man's love. And it worked so completely that within a few decades, a diamond ring went from an optional luxury to something most people now describe, incorrectly, as an ancient romantic tradition rather than a mid-20th century marketing success. And that's where this story turns the same direction the others have. Because for most of human history, marriage existed primarily as an economic and legal arrangement, a contract meant to create financial stability, protect property, and formalize obligations between families. Romantic love as the primary reason to marry, the idea now considered the entire point of a wedding, is historically a very recent development, what sociologists call companionate marriage, which only became the dominant Western ideal in the 18th and 19th centuries. We built the modern wedding on top of an ancient system originally designed for financial security. And now, according to widely cited wedding industry data, couples in many countries routinely go into debt to fund a single day meant to celebrate exactly the kind of stability the institution was originally invented to guarantee. So here's the honest answer. There was no single moment humans invented the wedding. There was a Sumerian property contract, an Egyptian reed ring, a Roman veil meant to scare off spirits, a medieval handshake in front of witnesses, a 19th century queen's lace dress, and a 20th century advertising slogan, each one bolted onto the last until an economic arrangement between two families slowly became the elaborate, symbol-heavy event we now call a wedding. Tonight, somewhere, someone is signing a prenup that would look almost identical to a 4,000-year-old Sumerian clay tablet. And somewhere else, two people are simply telling each other, in front of witnesses, that they belong together now, doing, in the most basic sense, exactly what people have always done. If you want the next hidden history behind something you'd never think to question, subscribe, because the next one's already coming.